Dear everyone, we are just seeing that people are about to log back to Zoom for our next panel. And I would suggest we just wait a couple of more minutes before we officially start, just to allow a little bit of an extra couple of minutes for people to join and return from their lunch break. But I think that we could very well have the next presentation slides shared. So Dr. Trapp, if you would like to share your screen and have the title of the presentation already set up, I think that should be absolutely fine. That's perfect. And I think that we can just wait a couple of extra minutes, and we'll start. For everyone who is joining us just for the afternoon session, just a couple of reminders, couple of clarifications. Please use the Q&A function to post any questions, any comments or thoughts while during the talks or after the talks. If something comes to mind, we are monitoring this, and we'll be happy to bring on those comments, questions, and thoughts during the discussions. Also, please note there is simultaneous interpretation from English into Bulgarian. And to access that, please use the globe button at the main Zoom panel. That should be one of the last buttons down there. I think that people are still continuing to join, but we can all very well also reconvene and gradually get started with this afternoon session for today's event. So hello again, everyone. Thanks a lot for being part of today's event, countering the misuse of CBRN materials and related information. We had a very productive first session this morning with a lot of insightful talks and comments, questions, and discussions around emerging threats, CBRN threats, and factors impacting on the threat spectrum. And for this afternoon, we will to some extent continue to look at some of those threats, but we will also we'll try to look at some of the options also for prevention and countering those threats. Also there'll be an opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the work that has been conducted within the scope of the Mask CBRN initiative, which is essentially the, if you like, the overarching frame under which we are convening for today's event. Once again, for this afternoon session, we have a very interesting lineup of talks. The first speaker on our panel for this afternoon is Dr. Ralph Trapp, who will be addressing Russian allegations of biological weapon activities in Ukraine. It's a topic that I think we are all very well familiar already, simply because that has been on the news for quite a number of months now. And for for people familiar, of course, with the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, those kinds of allegations are definitely, you would be familiar that these are not new phenomenon, but the intensity that we've been witnessing over the recent months has really been of a staggering scale, and it's a topic worth addressing when we are thinking about CBRN threats. And just a couple of words about our speaker. So Dr. Ralph Trapp, he's an independent consultant on chemical and biological weapons, arms control and disarmament. He's a chemist and toxicologist by training, and he was a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, CIPRI, and also for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He has worked for a number of years with the Technical Secretariat of the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that is based in The Hague, and is the watchdog for the Chemical Weapons Convention. At present time, he's essentially working on different international initiatives in collaboration with UN agencies, once again, the OPCW, the European Commission, and international civil society think tanks, organizations, you name it. Without any further ado, Dr. Trapp, please, you have the floor, and we very much look forward to your presentation. And thanks a lot for agreeing to be with us today.
Thanks, Tatiana, and thank you very much, you and the organizers, for inviting me for this meeting. As you just mentioned, I'm going to talk about allegations that we've seen go through the media, but not only in the media, but also in diplomatic circles, Russian allegations about biological weapons activities in the Ukraine, and in this context, also, by the way, in other countries, but the focus at the moment very much is on the Ukraine, given the current situation with the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, then talk about specifically the allegations concerning the Ukraine and the United States and their activities, or rather funding in that country. I will look a little bit at some of the detail in the context of the process that took place, initiated by Russia under Article 5 of the Biological Weapons Convention. That is a consultative process in case of concerns about non-compliance. And then I'll say a few words about how this, from my perspective, works, and possibly what the consequences might be. As a health warning at the beginning, I should stress that this is, of course, this presentation has a very strong focus, given the circumstances, on Russian claims regarding alleged VW activities. But everybody who's been working in this field knows that this whole history of biological warfare is full of misperceptions, misrepresentations, false allegations, propaganda. So this is nothing terribly new. The context is new, and the intensity, as Tatiana said just a moment ago, is new. And insofar, I'm talking about that particular case, but there are, and there have been other cases where biological weapons issues have been misrepresented or used in a political context. Now, looking at Russia, and one has to really put it into the longer context of the Soviet Union and Russia, this attempt to put disinformation into the public domain about biological weapons activities of other countries is nothing new. It really goes back to the very beginning of or even before the Cold War actually began, with campaigns that some people have identified 3 major campaigns in this context: the Korean War, with claims of American use of biological weapons in this context, a whole range of different types of weapons and of vectors. A Pakistani claims against a Pakistani research laboratory in the 80s, which as a result of those claims actually had to be shut down. The claim being that this was funded by the US. That actually was true, but it was developing killer mosquitoes for release in Afghanistan. And then the other one, and that one I actually followed a little bit closer in the past myself, the claims about HIV, the virus responsible for AIDS. And there have been claims, some of them emerging actually in my ex-country, the German Democratic Republic, about the fact, or not the fact, but the assertion that this virus had been developed and released from US military laboratories that dealt with biological weapons research, and that the intention would have been to damage and to destroy African populations. There are a couple of things on the slide, as you can see here, that relate to why we know for a fact that this information was false. Admissions by people who've actually worked in the services that put this information out. Some archival material that was available at the end of the 1980s, and other things that are not just a suspicion that there was something wrong, but in fact it has been admitted by people directly involved in this. It went relatively quiet on the Soviet/Russian side into the 1990s, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Russian state. But towards the end of the 1990s, things began to change again, and we see senior military officials that were previously involved in the Russian biological weapons program, a program that, by the way, went on despite the fact that Russia was a signatory, is a state party of the Biological Weapons Convention, and also one of the depositories of the treaty, so has a particular responsibility vis-a-vis that treaty. Things, to some extent, were sort of a rehash of old misinformation stories that had already been put out. So a back reference to HIV again, and of course a back reference to the Korean War. But there were also new claims, and one of the most outrageous, as far as I can say, was first SARS and then in January 2020. We remember the claims that came out of certain people on the Western side, concerns, but also more strongly phrased claims that SARS-CoV-2 would have been emerged from a Chinese biological institute in Wuhan. But there were also claims coming out of Russia that it was actually a virus that had been elaborated in NATO biological laboratories. So this is nothing new. It has had calmed down a little bit and then went on again since more or less the end of the 1990s. Some of the characteristics of these campaigns, and that has changed a little bit over time. In the past, typically these things were planted initially into media outside of the Soviet Union, in other countries, in India, in Pakistan, and elsewhere, and were then picked up by Soviet media and were then basically spread, and depending on how the story evolved, then eventually taken up also by official sources or not. In recent years, we see a shift towards things coming directly out of official sources in Moscow, the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, and also in some cases directly from the FSB. And we also see a much more strong and a much more efficient, I should say, use of social media and the internet as a multiplier to disseminate the information and to bring it out into the open. It is increasingly aligned with the activities of other countries. I've mentioned here Iran, China, and North Korea. These are the most obvious ones, but some other countries were also aligning there, or were sort of getting involved in these campaigns. And some of the focus, at least if not a strong focus, has been on the US program to support the transformation of former Soviet biological weapons facilities under the non-Luga CTR program. The example that I'm mentioning here is the Luga Center in Tbilisi. And if you want to read up on this, here is a reference to an article by Philippa Lentzos in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, which sets out in quite some detail what these allegations were. And in fact, Philippa was on a group that conducted a visit in response to some of these allegations in Tbilisi and reported about that. She was the rapporteur of that group. So it is pretty clear that we're dealing with a very deliberate and targeted misinformation campaign. There also have been informations that were made available about this context, about this center, in the context of the Biological Weapons Convention intersessional process. Here's a reference to a document that you can have a look at. I mentioned already that this campaign in the past, or these campaigns in the past, went alongside an increasing and expanding Soviet offensive biological weapons program. So they were to some extent a front there to cover this program and also to direct attention to others, but also probably to some extent to find excuses or to generate opinions that would, I wouldn't say tolerate a Soviet violation of the Biological Weapons Convention, but that could be used, as I say, to protect that program. The other thing I wanted to simply throw back into this discussion is, before Putin became president again in 2012, he set out a number of tasks for the Russian Ministry of Defense. These were strategic orientations for the ministry. And there was a task in there which was quite interesting, and it looked at science-based new developments and principles. And amongst them, you find things, a reference to genetic and psychophysical things. That gets not just very close, that really gets into the realm of biological and chemical weapons of the future. Now, this was removed later on from government websites and explained as something that was actually not relating to what the Soviet, what Russia was planning to do, but what related to threats emanating from foreign countries. This is a technique that has been used in the past to explain things that in fact meant something different. Anyway, okay, let's now talk a little bit about the Ukraine. Here are a few examples. As I said, this began earlier, but just a few examples of things as we move towards the invasion into the Ukraine. Already in April 21, in Russian media are references to US biolaboratories in the Ukraine and elsewhere, specific mentioning of particular, not facilities, but places, Odessa, Lviv, Kharkiv, and also hints that there are risks involved, very dangerous work. And this little reference at the end, because the world is already experiencing the pandemic. This is the beginning of COVID-19, of course. So we're seeing an association here of, it's not said explicitly that this work was associated with the outbreak of the pandemic, but there was a link to this. And we saw that later on coming out actually as a direct indication from Russia that NATO biolabs were working on this. We then have, just before the begin of the invasion, state media in Russia and other media outlets, and also bloggers on the internet and elsewhere, providing a whole campaign of claims, a whole range of claims about the establishment of a network of bioweapons laboratories in the Ukraine by the United States. The US responded to some of these things in discussions both in Washington and elsewhere. And then in March, that's after the invasion had started, a statement that I found interesting, that in the course of this so-called special military operation, there were facts emerging that suggested an extensive cleaning operation to get rid of traces of a biological weapons program in the Ukraine. And then there were references to particular agents. So you can see that this was building up, and that was creating a certain picture of what supposedly was going on. If you go into this database here, which is an EU thing, or at least funded by the EU, I think it is, you get an idea of how intensive this thing was. I did just a very top level search for the time period from January 22 till a couple of days ago, and there are 286 results for the keyword biological, and they're not all necessarily about Ukraine, but the majority, absolute majority of those is, you can also go in there and see what the actual story was, and also the debunking of that story, because they were, of course, all misinformation things. But then it moved on. It moved from allegations in the media, allegations on the internet, and also Russian formal statements into something that ended up under Article 5 of the BWC. In December 21 already, the Russian Defense Ministry talked about American military contractors secretly smuggling materials into the Ukraine. Then came the beginning of the invasion, then statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that indicating that Russia has documents that showed clear evidence the US had supported bioweapons program in the Ukraine. And then finally, first meetings in the UN Security Council, which, by the way, are worthwhile watching. In terms of both how Russia had prepared this, there were a whole range of very sleek and interesting presentations made to underpin their claims. But also it was clear from those meetings that the majority of countries had nothing, had no information to any about any of these allegations, and the UN itself, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, made it clear on several occasions that the UN has no information about any biological weapons activities in the Ukraine. Then we get towards May and June, and increasingly we see an indication that Russia is going forward towards invoking Article 5 of the Biological Weapons Convention. About a fortnight before that happened, which was on the 29th of June, Russia actually submitted bilaterally a range of questions to the UN, to the United States. The US responded with a procedural response because some of the documents were not legible, so they said we can't actually respond to that until we can actually read it. But I mean, in a normal diplomatic process, even in a build-up crises, one would expect that this goes forward and backward several times, and that the parties to this dialogue would make attempts to resolve the issues before it goes much further. In this particular case, Russia decided to take it straight into a formal consultative meeting of the BWC under Article 5. Now, this here is a short summary of the main points that were made by Russia, and I don't want to talk you through all of this. You will have otherwise access to the slides. What I'd like to point out is here, remember what you heard in the morning session from Malcolm Dando and Michael Crawley when they talked about their methodology of looking at activities, published activities in that particular case, and how they tried to identify things that are of possible concern and that needed to be clarified further. And there were points in their methodology that had to do with policy and practices associated with weaponization activities. There were the context of a research establishment and the personnel involved in this field. And then there was the question of agents. And that was not just the question of new agents, but also indication of production activities and of work on dissemination. Bear this in mind when you look at the details here, because what we see here is attempts to say, well, yes, they have this culture collection at the Verknikov Anti-Plague Research Institute, and it's not consistent with Ukraine, with what Ukraine really needs, with what the public and sanitary situation in the country is. Yes, but culture collections are set up for a whole range of reasons, and they don't necessarily 100% reflect the actual current sanitary situation in a country. So this is a question of interpreting what is there and then trying to sort of move it into a slightly different, or give it a different taint, a different color. The other examples I here you see is the research documents on transmission of zoonotic viruses and by wild birds or by bats, a work which, by the way, is done in a whole range of different countries, because that is one of the things you need to study when you look at the zoonotic diseases. the discovery of drones, which, yes, may be an indication that somebody is working on something that has to do with dissemination, but disseminating of what? And what there was had more or less suggested that this was more likely related to agricultural uses. And then a question of a US patent application, which again, in itself, it's not demonstrate a violation of the convention, but it may be something that needs to be clarified, and there is no question about that. The question is whether one needs to take this into an Article 5 process. Here are some of the specific misrepresentations, and this follows a presentation by the United States at the Article 5 consultative meeting, so I'm not going to too much detail. But you see that some of the questions posed by the United States were quite detailed. There was quite a lot of specific detail by Russia. I'm sorry. There was quite a lot of detail behind it, and so sometimes you get the impression that it was about giving as much specific detailed information out as possible, and then something is going to stick. So here are some of the issues where you can say, okay, is this an indicator for malign intent, or is it actually something that is normal practice, or that is practice that makes sense in the context of the particular facility and institution that we are talking about, from storage of pathogens to transfer of strains. There were also a few things where simply text was misquoted or misinterpreted. And then there is a reference to this technical assistance plan. So there are a couple of legal issues that also came up in terms of how you interpret the fact that something is required in the local context of the Ukraine and make that part of a suspicious activity. I'm not saying that all of this is necessarily, I mean, there's a lot of factual information behind it, and I can see that people may even have concerns about some of these things. But the normal process in the BWC context is that you then, on a bilateral basis, try to clarify these things with the other side and figure out what's actually going on. And by the way, there are also mechanisms that you can use in the regular BWC processes. Is this all worth taking it to a formal consultative process, which actually builds on an underlying assumption that there was possibly a violation of the Biological Weapons Convention? Here are a few more examples, and that's one of the things I wanted to also flag up. A lot of these things have to do with transparency of activities, with the transparency of why research is done, whether it is reported about, what the context was, and so on and so forth. And Russia made a very specific association with the mechanism of the BWC in the context of confidence building measures, saying that none of this had been reported. And that is probably true, because, I mean, I don't have access to the CBM forms, but not the forms, but the actual responses by countries. But I know from the structure of the forms that this is not about providing information as such about bilateral assistance in certain areas. I'm not suggesting one shouldn't talk about that. I'm not suggesting one shouldn't adapt the CBM forms to make it give them a broader range. That's been attempted several times to make them more useful for what they are supposed to be doing. We're just building confidence and compliance. But it's not that this was all secret. I mean, the information about these activities, about the facilities, etc., was on the internet. It was presented at BWC intersessional meetings. The studies were published, and a whole range of other countries were involved in these activities, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. And also, it is actually a formal requirement of this funding stream from the United States that study results and other aspects of these studies must be made publicly available and published. So you can see where this came from. So here's the outcome of this process. And it essentially was a procedural report that came out of it. There's no decision, obviously, no consensus was reached regarding the formal outcome of the meeting, whether or not there was compliance or not non-compliance. But it's clear from the whole context, and it's very clear from reading the statements at the meeting, that the absolute majority of countries didn't buy into the claims from Russia. Even the close allies of Russia stopped short of sort of taking that last step and claiming that there was, in fact, indication of treaty violations. China, who went the furthest, called for more efforts to respond to the questions, listed some additional questions, and was supportive of the Russian call for a follow-up activity, which would be under Article 6 of the convention, which would take it into the UN Security Council. We'll see whether that's going to happen, and we also see how this is all going to affect the proceedings and the discussions at the upcoming BWC review conference. For me, the most sort of the best summary that I've seen, and also from a country that is not in NATO and is not, it's basically a neutral country, Switzerland, is at the bottom of the screen, which put out a firm view that the allegations made have not been substantiated, that the conclusions drawn are neither convincing nor credible, and that they do not allow to draw a conclusion that obligations under the treaty had been violated. That very much summarizes also my impression of reading the documentation that was made available. So why is this happening, and also how is it happening? And here I'm moving into a domain that where I'm probably more speculating and relying on other people's research and work. But there is a strong component, obviously, in influencing domestic audiences, in supporting the activities, the invasion in Ukraine, and to basically creating an image of Ukraine as something that needs to be corrected. It also is and certainly has been in the past, an attempt to influence public opinion in other countries. The campaigns around AIDS, but also around some of the other developments, were clearly targeted against particular areas, AIDS and the HIV story about this being sort of constructed in US laboratories. That was meant to be listened to and recognized in African countries, and undermine the trust and confidence in African countries, in certain partners and countries in the West. In the Ukraine case, it certainly also was part of the justification for the invasion. It was obviously not the only one, but one of them, but it also is an attempt to demonize the other side. It hasn't necessarily changed the perception in the professional community of people who deal with the Biological Weapons Convention. But these accusations are out there, the processes are out there, the materials that have been used are widely available. And this is a very technical, complex issue. So it is right to be exploited for political purposes by whoever wants to try that. In this context, also just as a reminder, there is a special report that was done for the External Action Service of the Union, the European Union, on coronavirus disinformation. And here it was stated quite bluntly that the Russian Federation was using that disinformation to amplify division, sow distrust and chaos, and exacerbate crisis situations. So this is, in fact, one of the goals in this whole process, destabilizing societal aspects of our countries. How is this done? RAND Corporation came out with a report that called it a firehose of falsehood approach or propaganda model. You can see that at the bottom of the page here. High volume and multi-channel, it comes from all sides and it comes in vast numbers. It's rapid, it's continuous, it's repetitive, it rubs it in again and again and again. There's no commitment to objective reality. You will find facts that are actual facts, and you will find a lot of things that are not facts, and a lot of interpretations that are far from the truth. And also a lack of commitment to consistency. It doesn't have to make a consistent story. At the end of the day, something will stick. And so the more you throw it, the more you throw out, the more effective that could be. What's it all mean? I'm just putting out two. The first one is, I don't think it's a verbatim quote, but it's pretty close to it. The other one is verbatim from two people who are prominent in this field for a number of reasons. Matt Masterson from Harvard University, somebody who's been dealing with biological weapons and biological weapons arms control and issues related to it since, I don't know when, certainly since the 1960s. And he wrote at some point in time that the worst possible event, of course, is a true allegation of a BW used by a state. And obviously, since 1975, that would also imply a particular, if it's a state party to the treaty, that would be the worst possible thing that could happen. But the next worst thing It's a false allegation of biological weapons use. And why is that? It's because it suggests that a state party is violating the BWC with impunity. And you will recall that this whole argument about impunity has already come up in the context of chemical weapons uses in Syria. Mechanisms that we have, certainly in the arms control domain, are not very good. They're not designed to deal with impunity issues. You need other mechanisms, other approaches, and they're not easy to find, and they're also not easy to work. So here is a risk that somebody can actually create a situation where this becomes acceptable, or becomes where it gets very difficult to respond to it. And that's the other side of the argument. It can also lead to perceptions that biological weapons actually have utility and that they may be desirable for states to go for. Philippa Lentzes from King's College in London is making more or less a similar argument, but several decades later, saying that by claiming biological weapons lab exists where they do not, Russia is hastening the death of the taboo. So this is not necessarily suggesting that that is the intention that Russia has, but it certainly is a possible and likely outcome that the more this happens, the more it is possible that other states will question the strength of the Biological Weapons Convention, will question its mechanisms, will question whether one can rely on it. And actually, it might encourage countries in their particular context to pursue the acquisition of biological weapons in the future. I don't want to summarize what I just said. I let that sink in. What I would want to give you at the end is simply a list of sources that you can find on the internet. The first one is a piece that we put out with a new network in Germany that deals with these Russian allegations. That's already been done a while ago. It's probably about 6-8 months old. But you see the basic argument in this piece. The next one is a foreign policy, a commentary on the issue. The next one is a link to the meeting documents of the formal consultative meeting under Article 5. So if you want to read any of the documents, you'll find them there. The next two articles by Milton Lechtenberg, who has looked a lot into the biological weapons program of Russia, and also in these disinformation campaigns. In particular, the last one, the detailed supplementary material, gives you a lot of access to specific allegations and the context within which they were made and what that means. And then finally, the bulletin article by Philippa and Jess Littlewood, which has just recently come out and sums up the current situation about this field. And that's it. And I'll stop there. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trapp, for the very insightful and comprehensive overview of quite a complex and not necessarily easy to swallow topic and series of developments that we've been witnessing over the past several months. And of course, I mean, one of the most pernicious manifestations of that has been that we've seen high-level officials, people within military and within the high echelons of state power in Russia, essentially coming forward and pushing for those narratives, for those claims, and trying to present those as credible claims, whether despite the motives that's in any event, that's very difficult to find a credible explanation or justification or even an excuse for that kind of approach to politics, be it domestic or foreign policy. I don't know if we have any, I'm just checking if we have any comments or questions in the Q&A panel. I've noticed that, so just for information to everyone, and I hope that's okay, we've just shared all the links from your last slide in the chat. So all those resources and those papers, I would encourage participants who are interested in the topic to check them out, because there's been a lot of analysis over what has been going on in this area. So I don't see any questions at this point in time, but once again, I'll just use my privilege as a moderator, and I'll crack on with one immediate question. Again, it has sort of two parts. So what do you, in your opinion, what would be the implications of what we've been observing, especially in that consultative meeting on Article 5 earlier this year on the upcoming 9th Review Conference of the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, which starts next week. But also more broadly, what do you think would be the implications, or would there be any significant implications of what we've been observing over this year with regard to Russian allegations with the regime going forward in future and its development in the years to come, irrespective of what happens in Geneva next week? Thank you.
Thanks for that. On the review conference, it's difficult to say because it depends on how different actors who were participating in the meeting actually read the outcome, how they understand what the outcome was. I have a suspicion that Russia will not, after the meeting, want to put an awful lot of emphasis on that issue during the review conference, but I may be completely wrong. This is just my reading, and I'm not in Moscow, so I really don't know what the thinking is there. But I think they expected broader support, although it depends on how you interpret the large number of countries that didn't actually speak up in the meeting as well. That is one of the indicators, and I mean, Western countries were quick to interpret that as meaning that they did not support the Russian claims, and they did not, in particular, not support the Russian conclusions. Russia probably has drawn an opposite conclusion and said, well, they were not necessarily prepared to come out, but they also were not ready. They were sitting on the fence, and so it depends on what the intentions are. I would hope it will not. I mean, it will obviously be there. It's not. You can't pretend that the whole thing does not exist. But I still hope that that will not necessarily derail the conference. But that's a tactical issue, and also the reference that Russia and others have made to taking it on Article 6 back to New York is for me an indication that, of course, there is a clear appetite to continue with this, but not necessarily in the forum of the BWs itself, which either would lead to a deadlock in the proceedings, and you would end up in a situation where anybody who wants to can use this to block any kind of outcome of the convention of the review conference, which is not really in the interest of anybody. Whilst if you take it back to New York, from a Russian perspective, it's in an environment that they are much more comfortable and easy to work with, which is the Security Council, and they are one of the P5s, obviously, and China is certainly in some respect on their side. So so that I think is something one can hope for. The broader implications, what I'm seeing is not just the impact on the BWC, but the broader context of arms control, disarmament, and whether it's intentional or not, I don't know. But the result is very likely going to be, if this continues, is going to be that there will be more questions about whether we can rely on these treaties, whether they actually do any good, or whether one shouldn't at least increase preparedness. And then you get very quickly into this gray zone where people are going back to doing threat assessments and doing investigations and experiments and other things that you need to understand, to understand what the threat actually is. And that is just half a step away from beginning a more offensive orientation of a biological program. So there is a risk that we see a dismantling of the, or at least a dysfunctioning of the existing disarmament architecture that we have, without any alternative, but with massive challenges coming from advances in science and technology, advances and changes in industry and other things. So what we possibly might see is a destabilization of the system, and I hope that countries will realize that this is a risk, and that this is not just a political ping-pong game between the West and Russia, or Russia and China versus the West, but that there are broader issues at stake, and that this actually may have an impact on the security order globally in coming years.
Thank you so much for this analysis and for the comprehensive answer. Just building upon your last point, I think the broader implications really for specifically also for civil society and society at large, what we have seen, these are, in the end of the day, these are attacks on laboratories that are conducting public health and health research, essentially, and delegitimizing their work and undermining the credibility of their role in society is really one of.
Thanks for making that point, because I think this is, at the same time, this is a hope that I have, that countries will understand that there is going to be an impact on international cooperation in this field, on collaboration in the public health domain, in the animal health domain, on environmental issues. The ramifications could be huge. And so I hope there will be a resistance from, in particular, developing countries to let this slide down that track. The risk is there, but what I hope for is that people understand what the implications are, and that hence we will find ways to move out of this context and protect the systems we have.
Thank you so much. Let me just see if we have any additional comments or questions in the Q&A. I can see none at this stage. So I would like to thank Dr. Trapp for the very detailed overview and for being with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for the contribution. And with that, I would like to now move on to our next speaker on the panel. It's also one of those topics that has come, we've heard a little bit about it also within the context of the war that is going on currently in Ukraine. But of course, I mean, during this forum, we'll look at that in more broader and slightly more broader context. So we'll be switching now from chemical and biological and more mid-spectrum agents to really radiological and sort of nuclear arena threats. And it is with a great pleasure that I would like to introduce now Professor Andrea Malizia from of the University of Rome Tor Vergata. He's an assistant professor in nuclear measures and instrumentations at the Department of Biomedicine and Prevention. And his field of research is related to nuclear measures and instrumentation, software to stimulate radiological and nuclear dispersion and diffusion. He's also the didactical coordinator of the international master courses in protection against CBRN events. And he's cooperating with the most national and international entities involved in security and safety in this field. He lectures in physics, in laser systems, nuclear fusion, energy, measurements, and he's an author of more than 130 scientific publications and also a guest editor of international journals. He's experienced and trained in physics and plasma physics, electronics, and industrial engineering. Without further ado, Professor Malizia, please, you have the floor. And thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and for making time to speak to us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Novosilova, for the introduction and for having me and my university in your conference. May you hear me well? Okay, so I'm going to share the screen and start the presentation. Okay. Okay. Okay, so my presentation is on the radiological dispersion device, the improvised nuclear device, the dirty bombs. I'm talking about the risk related to the use of this kind of devices. I will tell something about the protection, something less about the detection, and I will talk about some method to try to prevent or at least understand in advance the effect of this kind of device if they are used. I have prepared this work together with a colleague of the University of Rome Tor Vergata, Dr. Riccardo Quaranta, and with Gianmarco Contessa from the research entity ENEA in Italy, and with Dr. Marco D'Arienzo, who works in the Italian health system. So this is the agenda of the presentation. I will introduce you the what is an improvised nuclear device, what is a radioactive dispersion device, and a dirty bombs, and we will see a little bit the difference among these devices. We will talk about some of the potential economic and psychological effects in case of the use of such a device. As I told before, we will talk about protection, a little bit about the detection, and the potential routes of dispersion. So let's talk about the END. END, it's improvised nuclear device as a result. This can be built in by a terroristic group, for instance, even in lab. And usually we do refer to this kind of device when the energy released by the device are less than 10 kilotons. As most of you know, 1 kiloton is a quantity of energy equivalent to the energy released by the explosion of 1,000 tons of TNT. So it's something about 4.1 terajoule, which is quite a huge amount of energy. So if we are less than 10 kilotons, we usually can talk about END. What are the effects, the main effect of DND? Well, the main effect of DND are that a blast is produced and there are light waves, heat waves, and high waves as well. And there is a sort of dust and debris that is pulled upward like to form a sort of mushroom clouds. And then you can have a radiological fallout. You have a light flash that can be seen until 10 to 15 kilometers, high velocity winds, and you can have, of course, the cross-contamination of animals, the cross-contamination of water, of food, of persons, and of houses as well. When we do talk about radiological exposure devices, we basically refer to those devices that are released close the person that can travel, for instance, on a train or on an airplane or on the subway. So basically the amount of damage depends on the type of radiological source that is used, the part of the body that is exposed by the radiological source, and the amount of time that's passed on having this kind of exposition. So we can have effects that are visible after hours, days, or weeks, still lethal effects like cancer. In the end, when we do talk about radiological dispersal device, we can say that the so-called dirty bombs are a sort of radiological dispersal device. What does it mean? It does means that basically it is a bomb that is done with regular explosive, and inside that it is added also a radiological source. So basically, the main risk is not the blast in this case, but the radioactive contamination that you can have. But the main risk is the dust and debris that are released after the explosion that have a radioactive contamination that can be transferred to the vehicles, to the animals, to the peoples, and to the infrastructures and the buildings. These are bombs quite easy to prepare if you have, let's say, the availability of a radiological source. It's very cheap and it's very easy to build it in a laboratory or even inside the room. And dirty bombs cannot be considered atomic bombs. If we do talk about atomic bomb, we do talk about a device that can cause thousands of casualties, that can destroy large cities, and that has a fallout that can reach hundreds of square kilometers. When we talk about dirty bombs, the physical damage is related to the quantity of the explosive that is used, and the fallout usually is large, maximum a few hundreds of square meters. But again, the availability of radiological sources and the, let's say, easy way in which this kind of device can be built make the dirty bomb a real and actual threat. Here you can see some, but not all full list, but some of the material that can be used to create dirty bombs. For instance, tritium, uranium-235, plutonium-239, americium-241, cobalt-60, iodine-131, and so on. These are present also, for instance, for medical application mounted on the TC, for instance. And as I told before, it is not much complicated to create a dirty bombs like creating a conventional bombs. It is not required a special assembly. You have just to need basically an explosive substance, and you need a radiological source. The hard part of work is finding radioactive material. What are the main effects in case of an explosion of dirty bombs? But first of all, we have for sure a potential economic effect. In which term? If you have a dirty bomb explosion in some suburban area of a large city, I have done, for instance, some simulation with my colleagues, and we will see it later in the area of Rome. There are very populated areas. If we take as an example the block Appio Tuscolano is in Rome. It is an area with more than 200,000 persons living in there. There are a lot of buildings, a lot of infrastructure. So if you have an explosion of a dirty bomb, you have this radioactive dust that can decontaminate the buildings. So you should try not only to avoid the cross-contamination among people, not only to try to decontaminate people, but you should decontaminate the buildings as well, which is quite complicated, or you should destroy and rebuild the building, which is very cost-effective, as you can imagine. Another important effect that is related to the economic one and has economic consequences as well are the potential psychological effects. In which term? Let me take you as an example one episode that happened here in Rome in 2009. In 2009, one person called the police, and just to make a joke, this person told to the police that he or her released a radioactive material inside the water pipeline of the city of Rome. It was a joke, of course, but somehow this news, this call went viral on internet and on the radio. And it takes a few hours to have the authorities telling to all the population that it was a fake news, and not all the population has been reached by the official news of the authority. So in the next 48 hours from this phone call joke, in the city of Rome and in the area surrounding the city of Rome, we had, I can remember, more than 70,000 access inside the emergency department. Now in Italy, we have a public health system. When you step into the emergency department, just to tell that you feel bad and you need a check, it costs to the health system roughly €300 per person per access. So you can imagine in 48 hours, we had accesses of 70,000 persons. And if you consider €300 of cost for the health system per person per access, you have the amount of money that the Italian health system loses in 2 days for a joke, for a fake news, for basically for a fake news that went viral. So the psychological effect can have the same impact of the real one in terms of economic, let's say, impact as well. Then there is also another things. Some of the psychological effects that are caused by panic. So you can have problems to the head. You can start to see a little bit flurry. You can have some nausea. You can have some vomit, some diarrhea. Are the same effect that you have at the initial stage of a radiological contamination. So you can imagine a lot of people with a panic attack that believe that they have a radiological contamination. It has been quite a mess. So we have to consider also that it's important to inform and reach the population with the right news through the authority, and sometimes it is not easy. Let's see now some of the protection action that have to be taken immediately after the explosion of dirty bombs. If you are outside and close to the incident, you have to cover your nose a month in order to breathe less of the radioactive dust or smoke that is produced. You have not to touch objects to avoid cross-contamination. You have to go to the closest building with windows or walls that are not broken. You have to remove your clothing. You have to wash yourself. You have to put your clothing in a bag and put the bag far away from other person. And you have to listen the authority for more instruction. If you are inside and close to the incident, you have to verify that the walls and windows of the building that is hosting you are not broken. You have to stay there and you have not to leave. You have avoid the entrance of radioactive dust through the windows. So you have to shut all the windows and doors and the fireplace dampers as well. And you have to clean the house or clean the environments if some of the radioactive dust enter inside. You have to turn off fans, you have to turn off heating, you have to turn off air condition. And if you receive some cross-contamination from the windows, you have to remove your clothes again, put it in the bag and having a shower. If you stay in the car, you have to close the windows. You have to turn off air conditioner, heater, and vents. You have to cover nose and mouth to avoid to breathe the radioactive dust. And if you cannot go home, you have to go to the closest building that can safely host you with the wall and windows that are not broken. And if you cannot go out from the car, you have to stay in and waiting that the road is free. If you are with your family or your children, you have to take care about you in the same way that we have seen now, and we have to take care about the children with the same precaution that we use for ourselves. And if they are in the school, we have to try to maintain the calm and leave them in the school, because till the authority tells us that it is safe to go to get them, because school has emergency plans and shelters. Some school has shelters as well. So they are in the safest place possible in that moment. Again, if you have pets and they are outside, you have to bring in inside if it is safe for you and your family, and you have to wash the pets to remove the dust contamination. Should I take potassium iodine? Well, you should listen again the advice of the authorities, because potassium iodine cover only protect the thyroid gland and not all the organs of the body, and sometimes is dangerous for some persons. So you should try to check with your doctor and listen the suggestion of the authorities. And what about the food and water supplies? Food and water supplies most likely will remain safe, but the unpackaged food that has been cross-contaminated by dust has to be removed. And if you have food inside the can that are sealed, you can eat it. Water inside the bottle that are sealed, you can drink it. And for all the other stuff, it is better again to wait suggestion from the authorities. How do I know if I am exposed to radiation or contaminated by radioactive material? Well, as you know, radiological contamination cannot be seen, smelled, felt, or tasted. So you have no idea if you are exposed or not. You have to wait the first responder, police or firefighters, to make a check of the radiation and tell you what kinds and what quantity of radiation you have taken, and if you have to go immediately to the hospital or checked by the doctor or not. What about the detection? Well, what I can tell about the detection, and there are three main families of detector that are gas-filled detector, and one of the most common gas-filled detector are the Geiger-Müller one. The Geiger-Müller can be used to do detection and not identification, so you can check if radioactive contamination is in progress, but you cannot have an information about the type of radiation or the type of source that is involved in that contamination. In order to do in order to have this kind of information, you can use other type of detectors like the scintillators, which is the second main family of detectors, or the semiconductors that are both able to build up energy. Some of them in the market are able to build up energy spectrum that can give you an information about the type of substance, because it is a sort of the energy spectra is a sort of fingerprint of some substance or some substance families. Almost all the products in the market have very quick time of response. We are talking about seconds, and if you are interested in having some details on that, there are a couple of interesting reviews that I can share with you, and you can share with the with person who are participating at the conference, or other person who are interested. It is not a problem. We do work a lot here at the University of Rome Tor Vergata on prevention as well, through the use of numerical software. With numerical simulation, we basically try to understand what can happen if there is the use of an improvised nuclear device or of a dirty bomb. We try to couple, of course, these numerical simulation with meteorological models also to see how the wind and the presence of obstacles can facilitate or not the dispersion of this radioactive dust. And we do use basically a lot this software, which is one of the many software available. The good thing about this software is that it is a free license, so we use it also for didactic purpose. It is hotspot that is developed by the Livermore laboratories in USA, and with this we can have a plum of total effective dose and of dose that goes on the ground, basically. So this is one of the paper that is open access. You can find it and download it online, in which we have analyzed the explosion of a dirty bomb. So we have analyzed it basically through hotspot, a dirty bomb attack in Rome, simulating the dispersion of radioactive devices. You can download and read it. And what can I say? What can I say more? I hope that all this kind of let's say all this kind of events and all this kind of threats, I hope that will remain just theoretical study and simulation, and I hope that we will not have it in our real life. Thank you so much for the attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Malizia, for the interesting and insightful talk, and for the comprehensive overview of some of the threats, but also the response measures that can be implemented and undertaken. And so I'm just looking at the Q&A panel, and I would like once again to remind all our participants that you can post questions and comments into the Q&A panel, and we'll make sure to bring those into the discussion. I see none at the moment, but I would like to just build on follow on a line of thought that you started in your presentation and ask a question with regard to that, because you did mention the risk of hoax attacks and how resourceful the response to such attacks like hoaxes and fake alerts essentially could be, and how people could misuse that. But it's the same pretty much with disinformation, because we've seen that with the ongoing hostilities in Ukraine, for instance, when there was a situation around Zaporozhye, which is still, of course, ongoing, but people in the region got on edge because there were rumors that there might be a leak of radiation. People started buying therapeutics, iodine, and all that. So my question is more about how could we be better prepared for this kind of fake alerts or disinformation or threats at a social level? So what could be done to enhance, so to speak, societal resilience, awareness, information about those threats?
The answer is easy, and the actuation is difficult. We should educate the people to believe in the authorities. And it's very difficult, because we had also for the COVID pandemic situation, people that take jab of alcohol or of peroxide hydrogen because some politicians say that it kills the virus, and they kill about the jabs. So it is more or less the same thing. There is the IEA news alert on the Ukraine-Russian situation, which is updated daily, even more than one information per day. And once I start to read this rumor on the nets, I just invite all the people that I know to read the news on the official news of the Atomic Agency. That's a inspector in the area, and that basically have calmed down the population. So first of all, listen and read only the authorities and the official source of information. Second, and this is something that we have to do all together, in my opinion, educate people to believe in the authorities. How you can do that? Starting from the elementary school, when people are starting with the babies, continuing till the university, and also in the conference. I mean, giving first of all the real perception of what is risk. Do not make a confusion between risk, probability, and magnitude of effect are related but are not the same thing. So the risk of an atomic bomb is high. True. Why? Because an explosion can cause a lot of damage to the population and to the cities. The probability of the explosion of atomic bomb is very low. Why the risk of dirty bomb is higher? Dirty bomb has smallest effects, but it is easiest to build up a dirty bomb, and it is more complicated to tell who has used this kind of device or where it is produced. So the probability of the use of this dirty bomb is higher rather than the damage that the dirty bomb can do compared to an atomic one. So even start to learn to the person the meaning of the words that we use when we talk about safety, security, and we talk about risk, and try to convince people with different background and education that authority are not making disinformation. I mean, the most of the authorities are not making disinformation, and they try to give this kind of information to help you to live in a better way your life, and not to get you in panic. So this is the first message. I know that there are countries in which the information is not so free, and in which it is difficult to have this kind of let's say of education. Even in the one in which the information is free, there are many people that do not believe to authorities. So maybe another step, but this is not my field of expertise, is work a lot in terms of international cooperation to try to reach the highest number of people possible and educate them at any kind of level. But before educating, you need the people to believe in what we are going to say. So this is the most difficult part, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. Yes, public trust and trust in institutions, that's something that's definitely COVID-19 has demonstrated that it's something that we all need to work on, even in societies where institutions usually do their job the way they should, not only because we've heard in the previous presentation where there are, I mean, we've observed where there are situations where authorities are not necessarily to be trusted and could use those opportunities, but even in situations where when crisis occurs, it's very difficult sometimes to discern fact from fiction, and having public trust in institution and trust-based policy is something that is of great essence, really. And we also have one more technical question in our Q&A panel. So one of our participants is asking, so besides wind, what other factors could influence the spread of radiological dust? For example, heat or humidity, Are they among those factors? And also, is there a chance of recovery, or rather, what is the chance of recovery after coming into contact with radiological dust? So, thank you.
It's quite a long answer. I will try to simplify it. Regarding the let's say facility of spreading of these radioactive dust, the most let's say important factor to consider are the meteorological conditions. So the meteorological condition can be divided in a series of classes that are called Pasquier classes. You have from A to F, so from a totally stable to totally unstable condition. Having, let's say, the maximum of stability of the maximum of turbulence do not help the spread to go very far away from the point of the explosion. So a small wind, let's say 1 to 10 meters per second, and condition in which you have environmental temperature 15 to, not the environmental one, I mean, if you are in the range of the environmental one, 15 to 30, maybe, and not a high percentage of humidity, maybe are good condition to let the dust go far away from the buildings. Then, if you are a very clever terrorist, let's say, you can use the canyon inside the building to help you to spread the substances. You have to study the wind among the buildings and the canyon. Otherwise, it is easiest to spread it where there is not any obstacles. But if you have not obstacles, usually you have not buildings and people, so you do not care to spread any radioactive substances. And referring to the condition, if you have acute effects, so if you start vomiting or you have your skin that is burning, you have to go immediately to the doctor or to the hospital. If you have long but small exposition to the radiation, and there is all the ICRP related to the radioprotection that's explain the table of the doses, you can or you cannot have affected long term, like some kind of disease or cancers. That is the worst case scenario. It is important to point out that when there are you can find the weighting factor for the exposition to certain type of radiation, alpha, beta, gamma, and so on, and the weighting factor to the exposition of each organ to each kind of radiation. This weighting factor have been obtained through statistical analysis over large amount of person from different background, ethnicity, ages, and health condition. So even those health factors are related to a statistical analysis. So it is not sure that if you have a medium or long exposition, you for sure develop cancer. You can have nothing. You can have a small exposition, but be somehow, let's say, have a genetic predisposition to develop certain disease, and the radioactive contamination can be just the, you know, the little push that you need to take the disease. I am not sorry, I cannot go into the numbers and details because it takes some hour, but I hope that I reply to the question.
Thank you so much. That was very detailed and also very understandable for people who are not necessarily in the field. So for that reason, thank you so much for being able to so succinctly sort of put it and present it in a nice and easy to comprehend and understand way. So, well, you're experienced, you're a lecturer, so what can you say? Thank you so much for this. I'm just looking if there are any additional questions at this point of time. I think there are none. With that, I would suggest that we can just move to the next part of the panel, and if there'll be some time for questions and additional discussions towards the end as well. I would like to use the opportunity to thank Professor Malizia for his time and participation and very comprehensive talk. Without actually further ado, I'll be for one final time today. I would absolutely abuse my privilege as a moderator right now, as I'll be also joining the panel with a short talk, which essentially aims to give you a little bit of an overview of what we have been doing within the framework of the MASC CBRN initiative over the past 2 or so years. I really have been very privileged to be part of this consortium together with colleagues from the Center of the Study of Democracy, and we've been implementing this together with partners from Germany, Greece, and Spain. I'll be introducing the entire consortium later on in the slides. But what we've managed to do is really we've managed to pull together a consortium of partners. First, with a very good geographic spread. So essentially, we are covering different parts of the European Union. When you look at the map, you see that. So we are very sort of regularly spread around the continent. And at the same time, we also bring together different types of expertise, simply because we've got research institutes, then we've got we've got an academic institution, we've got a private entity, an enterprise, and we also have a law enforcement agency on board. So you can see that in terms of types of stakeholders that have managed to come together within this consortium, but also in terms of a geographic spread, we've been quite quite lucky to put together this effort. And in the next 15 minutes or so, I'll just flesh out a little bit of what we've been doing over the past 2 or so years, and we'll introduce you some to the main outputs that we've had during the as part of our activities and as part of our work. Hopefully I would also build on some of the issues that have already been mentioned during the entire event today, both in the morning and also in the afternoon. Let's begin. So we've heard today throughout the entire panel in the morning, but also in the afternoon, the different types of threats and risks and that could be countered in the CBRN domain. That the security landscape has been changing since the end of the Cold War, and we've noticed the emergence of new and threats that before that I wouldn't say this, some of them were probably not entirely unthinkable, but at least not thought of that they'll manifest in that particular way as they manifest. And this slide really is just to illustrate and to summarize some of the issues and some of the threats that we are facing in this domain. I want to just go back to some of the issues that we've touched upon in the morning with the phenomenon of targeted assassinations involving CBRN or WMD materials. Here on the slide, you see Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with polonium, and that case was mentioned earlier this morning. Part of the reason why I think it's important to refer to that case and within this context also is that in a way it also provides an example of how those cases could be dealt with, because what we have here since last year, so in 2021, the European Court of Human Rights actually passed a judgment and had a decision and confirming that Litvinenko was essentially poisoned by individuals acting as agents of the state. So it took quite a lot of years to detect, investigate, identify the cause for his death, establish accountability, do the investigation, and but nevertheless, that decision in a way can be considered as a landmark decision in that sense, because it's really something that's one approach of establishing accountability in those cases. And of course, I mean, in the decision, it says that the two individuals were acting as agents of the state, and that there is sufficient evidence to conclude that. And the respondent state in that case was the Russian Federation. The other example that I would like to bring in, and again, I think that was mentioned earlier this morning, but it's in a way, again, it's indicative of the type of threats that we are facing in this domain. That's the Cologne ricin bomb plot, where ISIS supporters use the darknet to obtain castor beans to try and build a ricin bomb. So in a way, that case illustrates the new ways, in a way, or the what kind of instruments or what kind of approaches agents that may want to cause harm are ready to make use of and to realize their goals. And in that case, it's just the conflation of cyber-enabled crimes with this CBRN, within the CBRN domain, and what kind of issues that could raise, and so what implications that could have for assessing and preparing for dealing with this kind of threats in future. Again, I mean, those are, if we think about it, those are very broadly types of, in a way, showing the different the different landscape of threats posed by state and, in a way, non-state actors. And in both cases, we are already talking about activities that are not so easy to detect, using materials or agents that are not that easy to identify at first. Let's not forget that polonium poisoning was actually identified about a month after Mr. Litvinenko was admitted to hospital, and it was just a couple of days before his death that he was actually tested that might be a radiological poisoning. So no one really could think of that something of that kind could take place. So it's just sort of a couple of examples to help us think about and reflect on some of the issues also that we've been discussing during this morning and also this afternoon. So what we did within the MASC CBRN consortium to try and sort of make sense of that changing environment, risk environment in the CBRN domain. So we've done quite a lot of background research as part of our activities. Here, I have used one of the covers of the Bulgarian version of the report that was produced, and I would like to mention that I'm doing that simply because it's also for the benefit of the Bulgarian audience that we have, because we have quite a few of Bulgarian colleagues also joining us today during this session. But I'm fast to say that if you follow the link that is here on the slides, and the slides will be shared afterwards, and if you go on our project page, you'll see that those reports and publications, they're available in the different languages of the entire consortium. So all the main outputs, this and another report that I'll be referring to later on, are available in English, in German, in Bulgarian, Spanish, and Greek. So we've made sure that we covered different different target audiences within different countries. Within this research exercise that we had, essentially we were trying to identify what are some of the main trends and factors that impact on CBRN security risks, what are the types of those different security risks, and we did quite a lot of literature review to see what has been, what the literature has to say on that, some of the documented cases, some of the types of what could be expected in historical historical terms to occur as examples of misuse. And also, what is the CBRN security risk and threat horizon? So how are possible threats developing, and what are the factors that impact on their development, and what kind of threats we are grappling with, and what kind of threats we are likely to grapple in the future. So this snapshot here, it's just for illustrative purposes. We try to come up with a very simplified typology of CBRN threats when we're thinking about the misuse of CBRN materials and related information. So we are looking both at the material aspects, and that would involve the agents, pathogens, radiological, nuclear material, you name it, but also the information that is that goes with that material, or that would allow manipulating that material. That would be research papers or essential information for how to access, manipulate, work with this material, or also essential information how to get hold of that material, for instance. So we are trying to cover both those in a way tangible and in a way intangible aspects related to CBRN. And in this typology of threats, we essentially try to look at different actors, so both states and non-state actors, and try to look at what are the different types of forms of misuse that could occur, and essentially try and bring them in some sort of a systematic format. And of course, we discovered, or rather we reached the conclusion that some of those issues are very intertwined, and the forms of misuse are not that different. However, they would manifest differently depending on whether they're coming from a state or non-state actor, pretty much because of very practical considerations and aspects that need to be taken into account, like resources that will be available, support and access to infrastructure, and you name it. It's very difficult to imagine that or not so difficult, but a non-state actor, a subgroup, subnational actor wouldn't necessarily have access to enormous or unlimited resources, for instance, to put together an entire WMD program or a program on a mass scale, whilst a state actor, as it has been in the past, and as it has happened in the past, states have been able to do that, and some states have even managed to do so and to continue developing those kinds of weapons even after they have been prohibited and even after they have joined those international agreements and have signed up to different forms of international agreements and conventions prohibiting those kinds of activities. So going further, what we've been trying essentially to look at after sort of coming up with, or rather screening the surface and trying to understand what the possible threats are. We've tried to look at what are the potential goals of when we think about if CBRN security is the sort of the buzz term that we've used for essentially covering the entire spectrum of activities or actions that need to be in place to counter the risk of misuse, essentially. And to break this down in a more sort of easy to grapple with language. So we've thought of this in terms of two interrelated objectives, and one would be that would entail safeguarding CBRN materials and related information against misuse and diversion. Prevention is key here, and that first goal, that first part of the goals would essentially cover that aspect. But also, here's where that understanding can become a little bit tricky, is because also looking at the need for ensuring effective preparedness and response to deliberate events. That would include, of course, countering actions coming from both states or no state actors, taking into account that the fact that there are international prohibitions or conventions or agreements that prohibit certain activities do not necessarily stop certain states from embarking on those kind of activities. And of course, realizing this goes, we would argue, requires an all-hazard approach for managing CBRN security risks. And because of the breadth of those interrelated goals, and because of the breadth of activities that would underpin the implementation of an all-hazard approach for CBRN risk management, it's important to consider that CBRN security considerations are mainstreamed into different areas of action. And here I would like to just pause and clarify a couple of points, because you hear, so far I've been talking mainly about CBRN security and CBRN security risks and CBRN threats all together. I just want to make sure that so we are not necessarily looking at the entire, so we are not looking necessarily at the spectrum altogether. We do understand that, so we do appreciate that there are different considerations, different factors impacting on chemical threats, biological threats, and radiological and nuclear threats, which we consider the last two can be pretty much taken together. But what we've been trying to do here is to try and rather focus on the processes that would underpin or that are involved in the countering the misuse of biological materials, chemical materials, radiological, nuclear materials, and try to identify the common elements in those processes. So that has very much been the focus of our work here. And we are not trying to say that there is no difference between chemical, biological, or radiological nuclear threats, or that they all require one single approach to deal with, or any of that. Rather, we've been trying to look at how those entire spectrum of threats could be approached in a way, and what are the common elements in approaching those threats effectively and adequately, to essentially to counter them and to ensure that they don't manifest and they don't threaten societies. And as this figure just aims to essentially to illustrate some of those points. because what you see here is essentially so we've been trying to come up with a typology of the different regulations that are in place, or the entire regulation of the preventative misuse of chemical, biological, and radiological nuclear materials, and sort of find the least common denominators across the entire spectrum. And when we're talking about international regulation, that's slightly easier, simply because the governance and the management of those risks in the different domains has more or less evolved and has followed similar ways of evolution and simple evolution trajectories. So we could look at that from the disarmament and non-proliferation perspective. And of course, there are the obvious differences where biological and chemical weapons are entirely prohibited under international law, whilst with nuclear weapons, there is the primary instrument still remains the Treaty on Nuclear Non-Proliferation, even though there is the emerging norm that is on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But let's not forget that this treaty has not yet been signed or ratified by any of the permanent 5 countries or member states of the Security Council, or for that matter, states that already possess nuclear weapons. So even here, we have already noticed the obvious differences, but nevertheless, it is possible to capture that thematic under certain heading. Export controls and dual use regulations, and those were briefly touched upon this morning. Counterterrorism, and here counterterrorism would entail, essentially, we would argue that efforts writ large to prevent and counter terrorist activities in all their forms would be pertinent to minimizing and countering the threat of CBRN or WMD terrorism, or terror groups, non-state actors getting hold of those kind of weapons or materials to pose threat. Safety and security, that would include occupational health and security within institutions, within critical infrastructure, within those organizations that handle materials, whether for production purposes, for commercial purposes, whether just for research purposes, repositories of materials, you name it. So this is, again, one very sort of a broad area where you would have procedures and practices and regulations and policies across the entire spectrum. So those will be, and again, there'll be different elements for whether that will concern biological facilities or chemical facilities or nuclear facilities, or the control of radioactive materials. And the final sort of common element that we've wanted to focus a little bit more in our work is the information and the information security and cybersecurity aspects, because this is one area that is, again, very common across the board, and it's a cross-cutting for the entire, whether we are talking about chemical security or biological security or nuclear radiological security. That would include cybersecurity. It's critical infrastructure facilities, facilities that once again handle or use those kind of materials and agents and toxins and pathogens or chemical substances, or that are involved in the production, for example, of nuclear energy, or you name it. And again, information and cybersecurity, given that a lot of the information nowadays in a digital format, digital form, it's good to consider both of those aspects. And when we think about those different elements of the international or of the management or the governance or regulation of those kind of risks, it's helpful to think of this as in a way as a web, where the goal is really to have sufficient amount of barriers or sufficient number of barriers so that whoever decides to go down path of actually embarking on activities related or involving the misuse of those kind of materials, that there'll be sufficient number of barriers to prevent and to stop them essentially from doing so. And of course, all those elements would be then pertinent to strengthen and promote and ensuring the resilience of international norms in the disarmament and non-proliferation arena. So with that in mind, we try to discern what CBRN security capacity at the national level might entail. And as you can imagine, and from what has just been said over the past few minutes, you might imagine that it was quite of a broad type of quite a wide-ranging exercise that we tried to complete here on a task that we had ahead. But what we've tried to do is essentially we've tried to look at how capacity has been already approached in other different areas and see if we can learn a little bit more from how it has been approached and already in other fields. And one helpful way of thinking about capacity is, in very basic terms, to consider capacity as the power of a given system or organization or an individual to produce certain functions or to produce or to perform certain functions. And this is key because that essentially implies, so the main implication of that is that capacity is not then a fixed state, but it's part of a continuum process. So it's something that happens over time and requires continuing action. And in that sense, when we think about CBRN security capacity, so that would be the ability to perform functions of relevance to CBRN security effectively, efficiently, and sustainably. So that would mean preventing, safeguarding, preventing the misuse of those materials, i.e. countering the misuse and safeguarding those materials from misuse, and also making sure that in case of a deliberate incident that there is sufficient, that the system or the institutions, the actors that are involved in the response can respond to that kind of a event effectively, timely, and efficiently. So in that sense, we were trying to look at, and we've embarked on developing a dynamic model on CBRN security capacity that focuses on the interactions between the different competent authorities and stakeholders. So we focus not so much on, so we've highlighted what is needed to be there within a system to say that system would operate effectively, but the focus was more on how the elements within that system or how the actors within that system would interact and essentially coordinate and operate and collaborate together. Right. So the purpose of this slide is essentially to give you just a snapshot of how we approach the idea of CBRN security capacity and how we approach this in terms of dimensions, because capacity, the idea of capacity and the concept of capacity as a as the ability of the system to perform can be approached in terms of dimensions. And we've tried to use that model and see how that model might look like in the field of CBRN security. So we've identified 4 relevant dimensions. One would be the policy and regulatory dimension, the institutional dimension, and those are pretty much the obvious ones. But then there is the operational dimension and the technical dimension. And the operational and technical dimension are those that essentially would give that system its dynamic so it's the part of this dynamic model, and would essentially characterize then they'll be characteristic of this dynamic model, because they essentially would contain those elements that are relevant to how stakeholders and competent authorities and relevant actors within that system operate and interact and communicate when it comes to the realization of the goals related to CBRN security. And I'm fast to say that so this already this figure and some of the previous ones that I've mentioned, so they come from one of our main reports, and what we have called a methodology for national capacity assessment for countering the misuse of CBRN materials and information or knowledge. And that report is already available on our website and in nearly all the different language versions that we have aimed to produce that. And there are a couple of those to be added, but it's nearly completed. So if you're interested and to read and to look through that, and there is quite a lot of again also illustrative material that we've included there, and some of the background material, some of where the concepts come from. It's all provided in that report, and it can be accessed on our website, and I'll be referring to the link just in the next few slides. So when we're thinking about the dimensions of CBRN security capacity, we decided to go a little bit deeper with that model and essentially think about how each dimension of that model can be characterized. And it could be characterized in terms of modalities. And those indicative, so we've identified indicative modalities for each of the dimensions of that system level, what we call national level capacity. And in that methodology that we developed, we essentially have identified a set of questions that are designed to help collect and generate data for those different indicative modalities. And of course, I mean, the modalities are not necessarily, the list is not exhaustive, but the questions that we provided there, that's why they're sort of more general, but they're designed to sort of elicit as much information as possible. And if that framework is applied in practice, then it can be applied either to specific domains, say for biological, so capacity for national biological security, or just in the realm of chemical security, or just in the realm of radiological and nuclear security, or it can be applied across the entire, all the different domains to collect data, what is happening in all those different spheres at the national level, and the amount of data that will be generated can then be used to develop an in-depth picture of what is essentially happening at national level. And the goal of that exercise, of course, would be either to, well, could be, for instance, to have a snapshot of the current situation, what already exists in terms of capacity, but also could be used to identify existing good practices, or also good practices that may be transferable from one area to another. And it could also provide insights for how that capacity could be sustained over time. Because one of the important factors is not only of how we build capacity, but also how we sustain it. So the fact that one system or one system may have good capacity at one point in time does not necessarily guarantee that capacity would remain unchanged over time. So identifying ways and options for sustaining that capacity and for ensuring that capacity would remain effective and adequate to address also emerging and future threats. it's of key importance here. So in the next couple of slides, what I have done is just essentially taken out some of the indicative modalities that we have identified for each of the different dimensions. So you can see here for the policy regulatory dimension. So that will be essentially looking at what are different policy strategic frameworks at the national level, relevant regulations, legal acts, laws, you name it, but also certification, licensing procedures, any standard setting documents and initiatives, guidelines, and also voluntary initiatives and also options for sector self-regulation, be it, for instance, at industrial level or academic or more civil society, sort of more broader civil society level. So for the institutional dimension, again, looking at what are the competent authorities, whether that will be designated to meet certain international functions and international sort of requirements, or that those would be specific for as prescribed in national regulations and national acts, specialized agencies that will involve, that perform functions that are of relevance to CBRN security, any designated that could be departments or units, so it doesn't necessarily need to be just an entire sort of organization, specialized agency. So it could be, in some institutions, it can be a specific department, office, committees, and also designated officers. So for instance, people within certain facilities where they may have people responsible for safety, security, those may be just one or two individuals, but nevertheless, they would still be considered under this this dimension for the purposes of the system level or national level assessment. Going further, so this is where it becomes really interesting, and I'll be referring to the operational dimension in the next couple of slides as well. Here, I'm just going to briefly cover some of the issues that we have identified, or some of the indicative modalities that we've thought it would be worth focusing. And essentially, those are already more related to what actions or what activities need to be implemented, how are those activities essentially implemented. So more of a qualitative type of, in a way, assessment or qualitative sort of screening of the situation. And those are all sort of processes and activities that are relevant to countering the misuse of CBRN materials and information. And it's quite of a long list. I wouldn't necessarily go into that into greater detail just yet, because I'll be returning to this point in the next couple of slides. But you can see that. So the activities range from activities related to prevention, material accountability, and verifications and inspections, and you name it, licensing, to activities that are related to response in case of an event that need to be investigated, but also incident management and provision of medical care, medical assistance, securing the incident site, investigation, identification of suspects, and you name it, and also risk communication with we've sort of thought that's one aspect that would require attention here, and in a very broad term. So here, risk communication really would essentially cover issues related to how level of awareness about those risks within different professional communities, within those sectors and working within those fields to activities related, for instance, to strategic communication and essentially reaching out to the public regarding relevant policy and regulatory or government-led initiatives and actions. So a very broad sort of set of activities that would go under this kind of a heading. And finally, we've got the technical dimension, where we've got also a sort of a comprehensive list of indicative modalities, where that essentially would more refer to what is available for the performance of. So if the operational dimension essentially refers to what functions or what activities or what actions need to be taken, implemented, and completed. So here is more what do you need to complete those activities on a regular basis, and that would cover the availability of specialized equipment that is well maintained, and any resources that are available, and that would include different systems and technology, be it for the physical protection of sensitive materials, but also for tracking and the tracing of that kind of material, for data exchange, for electronic record keeping, for cybersecurity, the availability of trained personnel at public and private sectors, level of profession, so the availability of professional competence and expertise, again, both in public and private sectors, and also the availability of options and resources and opportunities for technology development, procurement, and its effective and efficient maintenance. So to sum up what has been said just until now, so we try to, in a way, come up with an elegant way of summarizing all that information in a way that is not that, try to bring all that abstract subject matter to a more of a practical type of in a way template, but template is a little bit too strong of a word, but just at this table, what we've tried to do is really to try and bring all those different dimensions and how the information that is collected about all those different dimensions could be categorized in a systematic way. And we sort of come up with three areas that are in a way common for each of those dimensions, that how the collected data could be organized, and that would include defense and civil protection, counterterrorism, and oversight of activities that would involve chemical, biological, nuclear, or radioactive materials or related information. So the idea of this was really to sort of try and bring all that material together in a more of an organized way, and it's, once again, it's indicative. So it's one way of approaching that to make sure that all the information that is collected throughout the questions, because for each set of modalities there are questions in the methodology, and when you're collecting the data, that data can be organized around those thematic headings for each of the different domains or each of the different threat areas, so to speak. So as I mentioned, I'm now returning to the operational dimension that we had in the methodology, because one of the outputs that we had as part of the project essentially was sort of a training guide, which is designed to facilitate the preparedness and training of individuals involved in the designated as first responders in case of a deliberate CBRN event. And of course, I mean, when we are referring to a deliberate CBRN event, probably the more precise term would be where there is a suspected use of CBRN materials. And that, of course, suspicious event where that may also be of suspicious origins, and where not necessarily related to an industrial accident or something happening as a result of a natural disaster or a natural disease outbreak, more of events of deliberate sort of character. And again, this publication here, you see the cover of the Bulgarian version of the guide, but that publication is available in as similarly to the methodology. Actually, it's available in German, Greek, English, and Spanish, and you can find information of how to access that publication on our project website. But very, very quickly and very briefly about this publication. So essentially, the goal is to facilitate the practical application of the principles, concepts, and procedures for interagency interoperability, but also coordination and communication during the response to CBRN events. And the guide itself contains thematic scenarios, and those thematic scenarios are all accompanied with additional sort of topics and suggested topics and issues for consideration and discussion, and as such could complement that part of the implementation of the methodology that refers to the operational aspects. So it could be used for instance, for carrying out tabletop exercises or for field exercises to try to test different manuals or instructions or already existing tools or procedures for managing those kind of event sites. And the scenarios that are contained in the guide, they are all fictitious, but are based on real life cases. And all the scenarios essentially refer to to incidents or to deliberate events caused by non-state actors. But each of those scenarios can, of course, be tailored and adapted to different kind of threats and to illustrate different kind of threats. And the reason for that, why is it to adapt them? It's essentially that the scenarios have been developed as part of thematic exercises. So there are in total there are 5 thematic exercises, and those exercises focus on try to bring together specific issues related to CBRN threats. So they focus on, for instance, threats in the nuclear security, biological security, chemical security domain, but they also try to bring together different aspects, for instance, related to the manifestation of the insider threat or cyber-enabled crimes, and how those are relevant to CBRN security, to the protection of critical infrastructure and the risk of explosive devices when it comes to CBRN, then impact of emerging technology, and also there is a scenario that specifically looks at hoax incidents. So in that sense, the goal here is to cover a very broad set of issues with regard to the CBRN threat spectrum. And I'm just wrapping up here now. As I promised, here is our small but efficient, as you could see, project consortium. So besides our institution, the Center for the Study of Democracy, so we've got the Police Academy in Bavaria, who have partnered with us on this, the Center for Security Studies in Greece, CHEMEA, the way they are more famous in this arena, and also our Spanish partners from IBATEC and the security guard or the police force of the Basque Country in Spain. So together with our partners, we've been sort of working on and implementing those activities. And as a final snapshot, I just wanted to bring in our just a quick snapshot of our website with resources that have already been developed within the framework of the project. And I would like to encourage you to explore and get more information about. That's our webpage, where you can find all the different publications and materials that have been produced, and there are some additional yet to come. So watch that space. We also try to look at and post and regularly keep up to date with different developments within the field of CBRN security and identify, for instance, relevant policy initiatives, relevant publications or news pieces, and raise awareness of those as well. So once again, I would just encourage you to go and check out our website. And with that, I would like to thank you all for the attention. I do apologize because I suspect that I've gone massively over time. And I would like to really thank you for listening and for participating in today's event. Now I'll just put my moderator's hat once again. I'll just stop sharing here. And I've seen that there is some activity in the Q&A. Right. So, okay. So we have a question here with regard to the importance of export controls and the value of national CBRN import controls, the value of compliance program, and the shared responsibility of importers to safeguard citizens' health, safety, and security. And I think that that's an excellent question that essentially links back to what we have from some of the previous slides, but also some of the issues that we've covered also this morning and throughout the day more broadly. So I'll try, of course, to tackle this question, and I would like to encourage other speakers on the panel who might still be with us if they would like to join as well. So when we talk about export and import controls, I think it's important to consider what the primary aim of those controls is. And essentially that's to ensure that sensitive or dual-use goods or materials are not diverted or used for the development or enhancement of weapon programs, or diverted for issues that are for purposes that are considered not simply not allowed under international law. And both export and import controls, I think, would be of importance here, because international trade and trade in strategic goods, and when we say strategic goods, that will be not only defense products, but when you think about, for instance, biological materials and certain chemicals and other certain materials, they would fall under those kind of regulations to lesser or to greater extent. Now it depends on the national regulations that states have in place as well, because there isn't a sort of, there are different international initiatives, there are different initiatives on the international level for that are aimed to standardize export and import controls, but those are not, so there isn't a, let's say, a whole agreement or an arrangement. There is a legally binding sort of a regulation within the EU. There are detailed lists of what is actually covered there. But in short, so it's essential that individuals or companies or facilities or institutes working with those kind of products, that they're aware of those regulations and that they are aware of the procedures that need to be followed if they are receiving or if they are sending abroad those kind of items, and to make sure that they're in compliance, that knowing with whom they're knowing from whom they're receiving and to whom they're sending them. That's one of the important part. And of course, I mean, sometimes it's much more important to know well, both are important, to know from whom you're receiving stuff and to know to whom you're sending that. Essentially, it's for anyone working within that field, it's important that they're aware of the regulations that need to be followed at national level, know the procedures, know if they need to be licensed under national regulation or national laws, so they need to apply for those licenses, to have those licenses in place, and to make sure that they are in compliance with the established procedures. It's important to know that import and export controls, sometimes they are, because they are part of formal regulation, they can be more narrow, and they may not necessarily capture all the different types of materials or agents or chemicals used. So for that reason, it's important that sometimes there is quite a lot of scope for additional, I would say, additional layer of initiatives related to, for instance, self-regulation within the business environment. That there have been quite a lot of self-governance initiatives, for instance, among companies that produce synthetic DNA. So to ensure that people with malign intent or who might want to cause harm do not use those business operations illicitly, and that they don't take advantage of those kind of initiatives. So there are screening protocols, both for screening of customers, but also screening of the orders that are placed to those companies. So there are some examples of such kinds of procedures that are outside import and export control, simply because not all of those materials or business operations necessarily are subject to the to export and import controls as prescribed by national regulations. I'm not entirely sure if I answered in detail to that question, and I'll be happy to elaborate more. But as I have already spoken quite a lot this afternoon, and during the day, I would like to sort of use the occasion to open up the space to give the floor to other speakers or participants, if there are any questions or comments on that. Any final thoughts or right. Well, I see that we have silence, but silence is very often silence is good, and we do appreciate it. A lot of you may already be quite exhausted, as it's been quite of a long day. And at this stage, I would like to take the privilege to thank everyone for your participation throughout the event. I'd like to thank all participants for joining us and for being with us today, and for all the questions and comments and inputs. I would like to thank all the panelists who essentially took time out of their busy schedules during this period to join and talk to us, both in the morning and in the afternoon. We very much appreciate your participation and your availability, and it's been great to have you. And Thank you for all the insightful and very enriching talks and presentations. I also would like to thank all colleagues within the MASC CBRN consortium, to all colleagues within the MASC CBRN consortium, without whom we wouldn't have been able to have the concluding event and to be able to share what we have been doing over the past 2 or so years. So thanks everyone for being on board and for partnering with us. It's been a long journey, but it's been a great one. I would like to thank all colleagues at CSD for those, especially to those working behind the scenes to make this a success, and special thanks to the law program and to colleagues with the law program of the CSD, and also to our communications team who've been tirelessly making sure that we don't lose connection and we keep on track. And massive thanks to the interpreters, to the team of interpreters who've done a fantastic job throughout our event. And we do appreciate that it's been a sort of not the easiest type of subject to interpret and to translate and to discuss, but we've done a great job, and we are very much grateful for you being with us today and for helping us to make this a success. And in case there are no